On the 10th of July 3018, Gandalf arrives at Isengard to seek counsel from his longtime ally and fellow wizard, Saruman. At this time, Isengard is still green and fair, there's no sign of orcs, no sign of any army, no sign of any industry, yet only a few months later, Isengard is an industrial wasteland filled with pits and forges, and not even a year later, Saruman sends an army of over 10,000 of his soldiers to attack Rohan. So in this video, let's ask the question, how did Saruman seemingly build an army so quickly? When Gandalf arrived at Isengard that evening, no one from the White Council had been in contact with Saruman for 65 years. After the White Council's final meeting in 2953, Saruman had isolated himself in Isengard, fortifying it in a way that made it clear that he was no longer simply acting as a caretaker for the Steward of Gondor. During this isolation, Saruman pursued closer ties with the Dunlendings, even going as far as providing them with some form of aid against the Rohirrim. Thus, even before Saruman's betrayal was revealed, people such as Gandalf and Aragorn were already deeply suspicious of him. But Gandalf's suspicion of Saruman was overruled by the belief that Saruman had knowledge, wisdom, and power that would be vital in the fight against Sauron, so he accepts Saruman's invitation, delivered by an unwitting Radagast the Brown, and rides to Isengard. When Gandalf enters the fortress, the only thing he notes is that the gate is heavily guarded, almost certainly by men of Dunlending origin, as the presence of orcs would be a cause of serious concern for Gandalf. When the gates close behind him, Gandalf suddenly feels afraid, but he doesn't know why exactly. Not long afterwards, Saruman reveals his treachery to Gandalf and has him imprisoned atop Orthanc. Looking down upon Isengard, he notes this: "I looked on it and saw that, whereas it had once been green and fair, it was now filled with pits and forges. Wolves and orcs were housed in Isengard, for Saruman was mustering a great force on his own account, in rivalry of Sauron and not in his service, yet. Over all his works a dark smoke hung, and wrapped itself about the sides of Orthanc." Gandalf spends about 68 days atop Orthanc as a prisoner. When he first arrived, Isengard was fair and green, and apart from the extra guards, nothing seemed amiss. But within 68 days, this illusion has been torn apart. Great pits have been opened within Isengard, and the forges within are being fueled by felled trees from the valley and the nearby forest of Fangorn, causing smoke to rise up high into the air. And to make matters worse, orcs and wolves, of which there were no signs of when Gandalf arrived, are now openly roaming the grounds of the fortress. In the space of 68 days, Saruman has went from reclusive wizard to the director of a powerful war machine. 6 months later, an army of over 10,000 would march out from the gates of Isengard. But this seems rather quick, right? If Isengard could go from nothing to fully industrialized in a matter of weeks, and could raise an army of over 10,000 in barely 6 months, then why the hell did Sauron take so long to do anything? After all, Sauron didn't begin the War of the Ring until he had been in Mordor for around 70 years, and that was even after Mordor had been reoccupied by his forces for around 1,000 years. Was Saruman just that much of a genius organizer that he could breed and equip an army that quickly? The answer is no. When Saruman cut himself off from the world, he seems to have come to the conclusion that if he wanted to truly contest the fate of the One Ring and of Middle-earth, he would need his own army. This is why he befriends the Dunlendings. They're a non-affiliated force, and their feud with the Rohirrim can be exploited for personal gain. And while the Rohirrim certainly didn't take kindly to Saruman aiding their enemies, Saruman befriending the Dunlendings doesn't exactly out him as a traitor to everyone else, at least not immediately, because while enemies of the Rohirrim, the Dunlendings are not aligned with Sauron. But while the Dunlendings aren't weak, they can't provide Saruman with an army of the scale that he needs. So around 2990, it's suspected that Saruman began breeding orcs for his own use. His initial orcs almost certainly came from tribes within the Misty Mountains who weren't directly in service to Sauron, as Saruman was only ensnared by Sauron 10 years after he started breeding them. From these orcs, Saruman gradually bred his army, including stronger variants such as half-orcs and Uruk-hai. I do want to point out that, unlike in the films, Saruman's entire army is not made up of Uruks. There's plenty of regular orcs in there as well. So by the time Gandalf arrived, Saruman's army had been in the works for decades. But if this is the case, then how come Gandalf didn't notice anything? Well, it's simple. Firstly, Gandalf arrives during the night. It's dark. but also Saruman hid his army, as he'd been hiding it for years at that point. In the case of the Dunlendings, those forces were probably in Dunland still, and wouldn't need to be mobilised until it was time to march to war. As for the extra guards in Isengard, while it may have been suspicious to Gandalf, that alone wasn't enough to indicate that Saruman had the ability to call an army from Dunland. It was simply a sign of the dangerous times that even Isengard needed to be well defended. As for the orcs, you would think they would be easier to notice. After all, they do tend to leave obvious signs of their presence, such as corruption and foulness. But Saruman also had places he could hide them. A. Underground, which orcs tended to prefer anyway, and B. In the surrounding mountains. In fact, Tolkien tells us that Saruman had forces, including Uruks, stationed in the Misty Mountains at times. Years before the War of the Ring, these orcs would sometimes raid Rohan, and the fact that they came from the Misty Mountains meant that it was many years before the Rohirrim started to suspect that Saruman had something to do with it. While this might explain the manpower, then how does it explain the industry? Because yes, when Gandalf arrives, there's no sign of it, but by the time he leaves, Isengard is a wasteland. I'd say that like the army, the industry was also hidden. It's certainly possible that in the years leading up to the War of the Ring, Saruman's workers were busy stockpiling supplies, digging out tunnels, and constructing forges and workshops beneath Isengard. So from the outside, Isengard would look completely normal, but underground it would be a completely different story. The industry probably wasn't operational at this time. After all, even if Isengard looks normal from the outside, it's not exactly subtle if the Forest of Fangorn starts disappearing, and there's black smoke being pumped out from underground constantly. If there was the forging of weapons and armour, it probably progressed very slowly throughout the years, only rapidly ramping up to full capacity once Saruman no longer needed to maintain his illusion of being aligned with the Free Peoples. This is when the tunnels and pits were probably unearthed, and when orcish workers started labouring above ground to fuel the fires. Once this illusion was cast aside, I don't think it's unreasonable for Saruman to have outfitted an army so quickly. He obviously didn't care about environmental destruction or workers' rights, so it's not like anything like that would have hindered the rate of progress. And it's not like the orcs were producing top-quality equipment. Tolkien described it as heavy and clumsy mail. As for the Dunlending part of the army, they outfitted themselves. Not very well, I might add. Tolkien tells us that only a few of the Dunlendings actually wore armour, and that armour was mostly stolen or looted from the Rohirrim. So, in conclusion, one might call the 9 months between Saruman's open betrayal and his full attack on Rohan as the final step of his preparations. He did not build an army in that time. He had spent decades building it by supporting his Dunlending allies and by breeding orcs in secret. The industrial capacity of Isengard had probably also already been built, it just needed to be set alight. Those last 9 months were just about assembling that army together in one place, and equipping them for a long, brutal war, or in reality a rather embarrassing war that lasted about 8 days. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. While Saruman is kind of pathetic as a villain, that's not a shot at Tolkien, he was just written that way, I do enjoy the amount of insights we get into his actions before the War of the Ring and during the War of the Ring. While it makes him less mysterious and otherworldly as Sauron, it does make for good world building nevertheless. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Saruman did a 3-town centre boom in secret. That's an Age of Empires reference. I'll show myself out.